Thanks very much, Steve. Good evening to everyone who is watching. Thanks, Steve, for the opportunity for providing an introduction and a basic overview of getting started with home brewing. And I will say it is a basic introduction. The science, you can do a degree in brewing if you like, and it all becomes very technical. But the purpose of this presentation is to use a practical approach. So how would you go about starting? Well, the first thing is to decide whether you want to do extract brewing or whether you want to do all grain brewing. They're fairly similar approaches to this. But in my view, the best approach is the all grain. It does require more skills, but not an awful lot more skills. So I would certainly go for the all grain. And if you're starting at home, you can buy extract and all grain kits from online companies such as Brew UK. And I will say that you can get these notes if you contact me after the session. I'll send them to you, and it's got this information on it and how to do it. So I would go for the all grain approach. So I'm just going to tell you the sort of basics of that. So the basics to start with would be you'd need to buy the kit, and the next basic things you need are something to mash in and something to do a boil in and something to ferment in. So you're going to have to buy a few stainless steel pots. You can use plastic, a bucket or a proper plastic fermenter for the fermentation process, or you can use stainless steel. But for the mashing, you can use plastic. But my own personal view is I'm going to go for stainless steel. So I started with a couple of stainless steel pots, around 30 litres in size, and the average homebrew kit that you buy online will be about 21 litres. So you've got some space there for the boil and for the mash to get plenty of liquid in there running through, etc. You'll need to buy a couple of filters. You need one mash tun filter, which will allow the water to run through the grain without the grain coming out through the tap at the bottom of the pot. You'll also need to have a hop filter, and that goes into the pot that you do your boil in, and it prevents the hops and anything else that's in there from blocking up the tap. So I've mentioned taps a couple of times, and obviously you're going to need to put taps in these stainless steel pots, which is not too difficult. You can buy a drill which will go through stainless steel. You can buy the taps online from a company such as Angel Homebrew. They're very, very useful. They're very informative. If you go to them and you say, you describe exactly what you want to do, they can point you in the right direction for a few taps. You will need a thermometer, a pH meter, and you'll need something to measure the specific gravity. Thermometers are inexpensive. pH meters about 40 to 60 pounds, so a bit more outlay there. A hydrometer is just something you float in a tube of the liquid that you want to weigh the specific gravity of. Very simple to do. You'll need a weighing scale, and you'll need a stirrer as well to stir the mixtures around. If you have any questions, please do jump in. I don't mind being interrupted, and Steve will tell me what your questions are if the system works well. So those are the sorts of things you will need. And there are various books that can get you started if you're not quite sure exactly what it is that you do need. So topics I'm going to cover in this session are water quality, as beer is probably more than 96% water, something like that. It's a very, very important issue, water, and if you ignore it, then you ignore it at your peril. So I'll tell you more about that. The second is temperature. You do need some way of keeping temperature well controlled, certainly during the mash and certainly during fermentation. So I'll be saying a bit more about that. You need to know a little bit about yeast and how yeast grow, what sort of environments they like, because you're going to be putting yeast into your beer, so you have to make sure that it's an environment they're going to be happy in. They are microbes, but like us, they are sensitive to pH and sensitive to temperature. And if you get those things wrong, you can run into big problems. And it's relatively simple to keep those things within the normal limits for yeast cells. So it sounds quite technical, but it's once you get stuck into this, it's not so bad.
We just got one question come in, Cliff. Well,
yeah, okay, Steve.
To ask, are there any particular books on home brewing that you would recommend?
Here's one, and I will put this on the end of these notes, and if anybody gets in touch with me, I can email them the notes, and you can get in touch with me at Downham Brewery at btinternet.com or through our Downham Brewery Facebook page. Here's one from Graham Wheeler. It's a camera presentation about real ale, because that's what we're going to be talking about, that you're going to be making real ale, which will put you streets ahead from many of the beers that you buy in a supermarket. For example, you finish up with some real good quality. This is the third edition, so it's called British Real Ale, Brew Your Own British Real Ale. It's by Graham Wheeler. This one is the third edition. It'll give you some idea when I started all this. It's a campaign for real ale book, and I found it tremendous. It's very informative, and it's also got recipes that you can go on to use as well, and it will describe all the things I've just described. It will describe them here. I absolutely recommend that. Another book that I found really, really useful is Homebrew Beer. That's most of us started in homebrew, and some of us finish up with our own companies, and whether that's a sign of success or not, I don't know. You'd have to tell me. But this one is by Greg Hughes. So Homebrew Beer by Greg Hughes, and it's got DK on it, and I forget what that name is, but that's the publisher. But if you put Greg Hughes, very experienced brewer. He did work for Brew UK. He's doing some work there now for them, but has his own brewery. Some great handy tips in there, and some recipes in there too. And if you're looking for a recipe, I'll give you a simple one on the way through this. You can search the internet, or you can look in both of those books, and there's some brilliant recipes in there for good styles of beer, British beer, and different countries. So right, we'll crack it. I hope that's answered your question. There are others, and there's some very technical ones, but you can save those for another time. And to an extent, you could say, well, do you need to know all this stuff? Can you just go and do it and run through the process? And to an extent, yes, you can. You don't need to have a degree in this to be able to do it. You do need to have the practical skills, and that's what this is about, is to just get you pointed in the right direction for those. Excuse me. So the first thing is water treatment, and this was something I tripped up on. I didn't take it seriously enough, and it gave me lots and lots of problems, and I couldn't work out what was wrong. I mean, I was new to brewing at the time. This would be about 6-7 years ago. I did some brewing early on in the late 1970s, and that was a boots kit, and I just stuck the extract into a bucket of boiling water, stirred it round, did all the usual stuff, and sometimes it came out fine and sometimes it didn't. And so that was just a very simple sort of thing to do. So the practical side of this is really important, and you don't need to know the in-depth ins and outs to be able to do the brewing. Depends how far you want to take it. So water. So what you do with water is you just use ordinary tap water. I mean, I can only tell you this from my perspective, and there will be other people that will do it differently. But what I would do with hindsight is send a small bottle of water off to a company called Murphy and Sons, and there is a link in my notes to them. They will analyze your water, and they will tell you what you need to do with it to get it into the perfect condition to brew beer, because not all water is suitable for brewing beer. So if your water is not suitable, you might as well stop just there. But if you don't want to stop just there, send a small bottle, send a small sample, 50 mils, 100 mils off to Murphy and Sons, and they will tell you what you need to put in it. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute, but it's dead straightforward. One is a liquid, the other is salts. They'll tell you how much to put in, and your water will be suitable for brewing really good quality beer. The mash is the next thing. So the mash is obviously the first stage of brewing. And before you start, you need to add some salts to that. So the salt I just mentioned a minute ago would be something like calcium salts that Murphy and Son sell, and you can get them from other online companies as well. But Murphy and Son will tell you how much you need to put in. And when you're brewing at this level, it's only going to be something like 13 grams. So the weighing scale is actually very important. But don't worry about that side of it. You need to go through this first, get your mind into it, and think about the different stages. And that's where both of those books are really handy for doing this. The idea of the mashing and adding the calcium and adding the liquid, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute as well, is to get the pH down, because the pH of finished beer is about 4.75. The pH of your tap water will be somewhere around 7.5 to 8, which is too alkaline. Beer is very acidic, so you do need to get that pH down, and that's what this water treatment is about. If you don't do that, the reason you need to get the pH down is that yeasts will only work efficiently in a low pH, and that's why you have to do it. So what you have in the mash tun is your crushed grains. So you put the crushed grains in there. They come in a crushed form. You can buy them as the whole grain if you want, and you can crush them yourself with a hopper. I tried that. I got a very sore arm after a few kilograms of doing that. And yes, it probably is fresher, but I didn't find it made any difference that it took ages to do it. But that's only my opinion of that. So you need a crushed grain, and that will come in your kit if that's the way you go with it. Or you cut out this stage if you use an extract. So this is just for all grain brewing. So you've got your grain in the mash tun. So the vast majority of the grain you're going to use will be Maris Otter Pale Ale. And if you're going for the average home brew is going to be about 21 litres if you're starting off. 21 litres of beer you're going to finish up with. And for that, you need about 4 kilograms, 750 grams, so 4.75 kilograms you'll have in there. If you want to give a little bit of body to the beer. You might put something like carapils in, and I'll explain what that is later. Or you might put something in like a sort of crystal barley, which has been slightly roasted, and that would give you some colour, and it would give you a slightly spicy taste. So you might well want to go down that sort of thing. But the main thing about the mash tun is this is where the barley will be steeped in hot water, and within the mash tun, you need to keep the mash tun for most of these recipes at around 66 degrees centigrade. And within 1 or 2 degrees of that is essential. Quite difficult to do in the beginning, but once you get the temperature of the water right that you're going to pour in there, then you shouldn't find it too difficult. Your mash tun, if it's just a stainless steel pot, it won't have any insulation. So you need to put coats over it, put blankets over it, whatever. Once you've got everything in there, you've got your grain in there, you've got your water in there, it's steeping. You'll steep that for about an hour. Some recipes is longer, about 90 minutes, but a standard straightforward recipe without too much of the specialist ones added on, like the carapils that I mentioned. And 1 hour is enough, generally speaking. So you steep your grain within the mash tun at around 66 degrees. So you will need a thermometer to check it and check that it's the right temperature. And once you're happy with the temperature, put the lid on it, keep it closed and cover it up. And it should stay hot enough for an hour or so. The whole point of a mash tun and the hot water is to break down starch within the barley, and the starch will break down to smaller sugars, such as glucose and sucrose and fructose and other sugars like that. Yeast cannot digest large molecular shaped sugars, so you need to have them broken down, and this was the first stage which sugar is broken down.
I've got a question that's come in.
Yep. Okay, Steve.
Also a couple of comments that people made just a little bit earlier. The first was from Tim Hill to say there's a really good new home brew shop on Milton Road in Cambridge.
Okay.
I don't know if you were aware of that one. And
I've seen one on the way into Cambridge, but I don't know what the name of the road the road is. But yeah, that's right. So that's a good point, because you know, usually these places give you some advice as well, you know, if you want to go in and ask questions, etc. Yeah. Good.
And then, from Nick Cooper, Highcliffe, Ian and Sue Cooper's niece Nikki here.
All right.
Having a beer festival at home in Cambridge, I am interested in home brewing, so that's good. She's in the right place to hear about this. Okay,
thanks, Nick. Yeah, well, you'll know how to get hold of me then if you want to ask any questions later or get stuck into home brewing.
And then we've got a question from Alistair Cook, who wants to know, do you ever use grain other than malted barley?
Oh yes, I've used more of a sort of lager, a pilsner grain. That was very, very early on, and I came up with a problem with that brew, but it worked perfectly well. And I used it because we'd had a tour around New Zealand to see what the craft ale industry there is doing, and it's big, it's very varied, and they like well carbonated cold beer, so slightly different to the way that Britain is seen in terms of the types of beer that we like. So that's the sort of base malt, and that worked fine. I haven't used rice, so if you want to do a gluten-free. That seems to be the way to go with that, which is fine. But I just haven't, I've spent my time getting our core beers right, which they are now. So I haven't sort of evolved into doing these other types of things, but no reason why you shouldn't, if that's the way you want to go with it and you would like that sort of beer. In terms of specialist type barley, so you've got you have things like wheat and oats that you can put in there, which will give it a head. There's lots of carbon and hydrogen in wheat and oats, which give you the molecules to be able to make a head on the beer, and people like that. Some people don't like that, and some people are very sensitive to wheat and oats, and they can taste that stronger than they can taste anything else. So it doesn't do them any favors. And some people are purists. They don't want those sorts of things in beer. But I tend to stick with crystal, which will come in different states of being lightly roasted to being heavy roasted. And that will give you a little bit of color or a lot of color. I use chocolate, which is roasted until the barley becomes very dark. And I use that, and that's great if you're doing a dark beer, if you're doing a porter. And you can use dextrin, which gives you there's certain amounts of dextrin in carapils, but you can use dextrin itself, which gives you a sugar in a form that yeast cannot break down, and therefore it gives body to the beer itself. So rather than it being a watery beer, you get more body to it. Some people use that. I haven't used that. I use carapils instead. So yes, there are other grains you can use, and there are other things like rice you can use. So I hope that's answered your question. Okay. So from the mash tun, what you're going to do then is pour hot water through the mash tun, recirculate it. You don't need pumps, you don't need tubing really. You get a bit of tubing. You can drain the mash tun into a pot. Have a couple of pots, slip an empty one underneath, pour the drainage into the top of the mash tun, and you recirculate it in that way. So it's by hand, and that's the way that we still do it. We still use, well, I suppose what are called artisan methods to do ours. And the first time you open the tap at the bottom of a mash tun, you need to open it wide, because there will be a lot of bits of barley, all sorts of stuff that will have come through, and they'll be sitting just behind the tap. So if you open it wide, the force will push that out. If you mess around with it, you're not, you do it a tiny little bit at a time, it could block, which will cause you obviously a problem. But open it wide and have the pot held right up to it. Otherwise, you're going to get a leg full or a foot full or whatever height you have it at. You're going to get covered in pretty hot water. And so you keep doing that. You just keep putting it in the top. When it comes out first, it will be very cloudy. There'll be lots of bits in it. 20 minutes later, it will begin to clear. An hour later, maybe it may come through very, very clear. But the more time I can only speak as I find, and the more time I spend doing this, the clearer the beer will be. And that comes out, the clearer the beer will be at the end of the process. So it's a lot of time, but it's worth putting that time in. You can use filters and all sorts of things to filter out this stuff if you want. A lot of it you don't want, obviously. When you're pouring it back into the top of the mash tun, I put trays with holes in on the top, and you pour it in gently. If you pour it in a great big gush, it's going to disturb all of the barley. And the way the mash tun works is you have a filter in the bottom of it, which will stop the barley coming out, but it doesn't stop the bits coming through. but the grain itself becomes a filter. So you pour what you're pouring back into the top of the mash tun, which will go down through the mash tun, out the bottom and back into the top. So it's recirculating. But do it carefully and do it gently, and keep about 2.5 to 3 inches of water above whatever trays you put in. I put trays, you know, sort of steel trays with holes in over mine, and I can pour the water onto that and it won't disturb the mash. But if you don't want to use anything like that, just pour it in very, very gently and carefully. It will take you a bit longer. Once it's coming through clear, you put it into the copper kettle. So that's the next stainless steel. The copper kettle was the original name for these things. So the boil is going to take place in the second of your stainless steel pots. Again, about 30 litres, 32 litre capacity. You're probably going to need about 27 litres in the boil, because when you boil for an hour or for 70 minutes, you'll lose a lot of steam. And that will bring the litres down, so you'll finish up with, you know, less than 27 litres. You're aiming for 21 litres as a final result. So the boil involves bringing the wort to a good rolling boil, and the boil does not start until it is the rolling boil. When it starts boiling like that, you're looking in excess of 100 degrees centigrade. And one of the purposes of this is to sterilize the liquid, because later on, when you come to ferment this liquid, once it's cooled, you need it to be sterile, and it will be sterile at that temperature. Above 70 degrees will pretty much kill most bacteria and most other microorganisms. So that's one of the reasons for doing that. The other reason for doing it is to break down large unwanted proteins. If these proteins were to get through into your beer, they would give you off tastes, and they would affect the quality of the beer. So the boil is about breaking down large proteins into smaller proteins. Some of these proteins are involved with taste and flavor and aroma, come to that, of the malt and these sorts of things. Some of them are the large proteins you don't want. They will be broken down and they will drop into the bottom of the boil. So in the bottom of this second stainless steel pot, you need another filter, which will be have small enough holes in it to stop hops from coming through. So this is called the copper kettle. So you boil for an hour to 70 minutes, depending on the recipe. It's a sterilization technique, absolutely essential. If you don't sterilize this, you're going to finish up with all sorts of bacteria in the fermenter, and they will take over from the yeast and spoil your beer. If you're going to be using hops, which most people do, and these come with the kits, and the kits tell you when to add them, the bittering hops you will add in the first 10 minutes of the boil. And if you're doing around 21 litres, you're looking at something like 20-25 grams of leaf hops, something like that. If you haven't got all sorts of fancy filtering, don't use pellets, because they will come through. The pellets break down into very tiny molecules, and they come right through to the fermenter, and they'll give you a very hazy beer. Probably won't affect the taste much, and it might even improve the taste, I don't know, but it will be very hazy. And much as people don't mind a little bit of haze, they don't like a lot of haze. So I would recommend, again, it's a personal thing, to use leaf hops. You can use gadgets in the boil later on that will filter out pellet hops. So, you know, once you get going, if that's the way you want to go, that's fine. But there's all sorts of discussions about those sorts of things. So the boil is still going, and the whole thing about the boil is that you've got the bittering hops in the first 10 minutes. In your recipe, maybe an addition at 30 minutes, maybe an addition at 15 minutes. at 5 minutes, and then at the flame out or the power off. So you can have a lot of additions or you can have less additions. And it would seem to be that the more additions you make like that, the better the flavour of those hops will come through in the end. But just follow the recipe that you have. For most of my brews, I just use the 10 minutes bittering hops. I might put some in at half an hour. I'll put some in at 15 minutes and at 5 minutes, and when the flame is out. I use gas, so mine is a flame out. If you're using an element to boil the wort in, you'll have to have an element inserted in it, obviously, and a tap inserted in this. And again, books explain to you how to do that. But if you've got hops free coming up against an element, you will have a smoky beer because they burn on the element. So you'd need another filter that would keep the hops off of that. But dead standard, practical way, use a gas burner. You know, the usual ones are about 3 kilowatts, something like that, or something a bit smaller if you've got 21 litres. And you don't need to worry about burning the hops. Okay, so multiple additions, really good idea. And then you know, there's different sorts of times on the way through. The early additions give you they're more about the bittering than the flavour. The later additions give you the flavour and the aroma. A lot of people say they don't give you any more flavour, it's all just aroma. Fine, they certainly give you the aroma, and you can certainly taste them, I think, but that's just my opinion. So that's the hops, that's the boil, that's why you do the boil. The next thing is absolutely crucial, is that you need to add either Irish moss or a substance called protofloc, which is just crushed, compressed Irish moss. And usually you add about 5 milligrams of Irish moss. I use Irish moss to the boil at the last 10 minutes. And what these do is they take out the large proteins. So the Irish moss binds to large proteins, they fall to the bottom of the copper kettle, and you get less of those sorts of things coming through to your beer. So then we come down to flame out or power off. And then the next point about this is you're going to have to cool it. The least perfect option is to just leave it to cool overnight, but that will affect the quality of the beer. So either you can, if you're strong enough and fit and able enough, and sometimes I was and sometimes I wasn't, you just pick it up, stick it in the sink with cold water in it, and keep doing that until everything cools down, which it will. You need a sterile cooking utensil of some sort, maybe stainless steel, maybe wooden, whatever, to stir it round, and that will increase the amount of heat that's lost out of this. It's going to be boiling hot, so if you're going to lift stuff like this up, be really careful with it. Otherwise, you can fork out on a coil of some sort, which you can pass cold water through, and that is safer. It's an outlay, but you can cool it down doing that, and that's probably quicker. The objective now is to get this temperature down as quickly as possible to 18 to 21 degrees centigrade. And as you do that, a lot of stuff will fall down inside, will fall over the filter. So when you come to start letting this out into the fermenter, it forms another filter. The hops will fall on your stainless steel filter inside, and will filter out a lot of the rubbish that's in there from the boil. And there will be a lot of rubbish, and that's what you don't want coming out into your fermenter. Outside of 18, yeast like 18 to 21 degrees, and outside of that, things will become difficult for them. They will get stressed. You know, we feel like if we're really cold or if we're really hot, well, they feel, I don't suppose they feel anything, but their enzymes don't work, their cells don't work. and they start chucking out all sorts of chemicals which can give unpleasant taste. So be nice to your yeast and keep it at 18 to 21 degrees. Put it into the fermenter.
Just to let you know, if, we've got just over 20 minutes left. The time
Okay.
running
Yeah.
away from us today. So
okay. Yeah, I shall move on to getting this into the fermenter. A little bit about the fermenter, and then that's it. And any questions, of course, at the end, bearing the time. Okay. So we've now called the it's called wort at this point, but we've now cooled the liquid down to 18 to 21 degrees. We can put it into a plastic bucket and just sprinkle the yeast on top. We could pour it into a sort of plastic fermenter with an airlock, all the fancy stuff on it like that. That's fine. You can buy those online, and they come in 30 litres, and you get 21 litres in there, no problem. And you can either sprinkle the yeast on top, or with either of these, the bucket or the plastic fermenter. You can do a yeast starter. I won't go into that now because I wouldn't bother with that the first few times that you do this, but it does give you a better fermentation, and the fermentation starts off quicker, is shorter, and gives you a better quality product. But it's another step you don't need when you're trying to deal with all of this at the same time, but just bear in mind a yeast starter. So you're keeping the temperature between 18 and 20 degrees. I try and keep mine down to as near 18 as I can, and then let it build up after a few days to burn up some more sugar, essentially. But what the yeast are doing here is burning the sugar and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. So the airlock will begin to obviously bubble. You know it's fermenting when it starts to bubble. And mine usually start either that night, they'll certainly be going well by the morning, and will last for 5 days, sometimes 7 days, sometimes longer. And if you can control that temperature properly, it'll probably last 5 or 6 days, and it's done. And the way you know it's done is you get a sample out of the bottom, and the specific gravity should be as per your recipe. Most recipes will have an original gravity of, I don't know, 4.5, 5, 6, depending on the strength of beer. I wouldn't go mad on a really strong one. Start off with a 4.5%, a 5%, something like that. Your specific gravity would be around 1050, 1048, the original gravity, and you're aiming for something like 1012 as your final gravity. So you get your hydrometer, you place the tube that it goes in under the fermenter tap. It's about 100 mils, and then you float the hydrometer in it, and you're looking for it to be down to 1012, might be 1014. You could still package it at that point, but really you want to get down to where the recipe says to get down from. The higher the final gravity, the sweeter your beer will be. So it just depends what the recipe is, but do be very careful that you get it down to probably a sort of minimum of 1014, 1016. Maybe I wouldn't go any higher than that, because this is live beer, and if you bottle that, there's a chance it will be either a gusher. When you open it, it'll be whooshing out the top, or the bottle could explode. So you don't want that either, because that they literally, it's never happened to me, but there are lots of stories about this happening, and that you don't want to do. So I won't go into this now, but there's information on here about carbonation in bottles and packaging your beer, and there's some references on there. And what I'll do is, if you want a copy of this, I'll send you a copy of it. It'll have the book references I've talked to you about already, and so you've got a bit more information there. So just a few sentences on what we've done. We've talked about whether you would whether you might choose the extract or the all grain. I've gone down the extract line. Sorry, I've gone down the all grain line. If you choose the extract, you miss out the mash tun. So you go straight for the boil, put your extract in with the water, boil it, and the rest is the same. But in my opinion, the quality of all grain is better than extract, but then maybe I just wasn't very good when I used extract. I don't know. I'm sure there would be people that would disagree with me. And there's so we've talked about that. We've talked about the water. You need to treat that. You need to treat that water, and you'll get a much better quality. We've talked about the mash tun and what goes on in there. We've talked about the copper kettle and what goes on in there. And we've talked about the fermenter. So the fermenter, don't forget, everything after the boil has to be sterile. So anything to do with the fermenter, don't start opening it up, lifting lids off to look into it. Every time you do that, the opportunity is there for organisms to get in. So that's it. That's what we've talked about. And thanks very much for listening. And I hope to be able to answer some more questions now if you have them, or you can send an email to me if you've got some questions. I'm very happy to deal with them in that way. So thanks very much indeed for listening.
Okay, well, thanks so far, Cliff. If anybody's got any questions, now is the time to ask them. So you can either put your hand up to ask a question and we'll try and come across to you live, or if you want to type a question, then use the Q&A that's on the bottom of the screen. While you're thinking of questions, I can remind you that there is stuff on all week for the virtual beer festival. We've got a couple of things on tomorrow, which are a beer styles discussion, which is being run by Ricky Dolphin from Burwell Brewery. We've also got Sam Calverley from Calverley's Brewery talking about the brewery and doing a tasting. We've got also on Tuesday, Ben Shepherd from Pastore Brewery doing a virtual brewery tour, which should be quite interesting. Wednesday, we've got Richard Naseby again from Milton Brewery. Those of you that watched his talk about Seba earlier can see him again talking about Milton Brewery. So we've got a few questions in now, Cliff. So
okay,
start off with the first one, which is what is your opinion on unfined beers?
Oh, fine. I mean, in terms of finings, obviously I said we use Irish moss, and others use Protoflop. Now that does give you a clearer beer, but the beer sometimes is a little bit hazy because there are proteins in there that haven't been taken out. But in my view of unfined beer is it should taste better because the reason it's hazy is they are flavour proteins which are in there. Some people use other proteins such as fish, stabilization bladders, not their urinary bladders, but the stabilization bladders. And of course that goes against the ethics of veganism, etc. And I wouldn't particularly like to drink a beer that somebody's using things like that in to fine the beer. So I don't use those at all. And that's my view. So all of our beers are suitable for vegetarians and for those following vegan diets. So that's my view on it anyway. That's the way I see it, I suppose. Okay, is there any more questions?
Yeah, we've got one from Pete and Andy. They say, hi Cliff, have you explored using oats, wheat, rye in brews?
Yes, I did a very nice brew using rye. I just kept things down to a minimum in terms of changing things, trying new things, because I started to go off on a tangent, and it takes time, and you finish up with lots and lots of different beers. So my aim was to have 4 to 6 core beers. We've got 4 core beers now. We don't use rye in those. What was the other substance?
So it was asking about oats, wheat,
Oh yes,
rye.
yeah, I did use oats and wheat. I tried those, and they do give you a good head on the beer. That was the reason for using them. But I found that actually you don't need them. If you leave the beer for bottled beers, this is, and even for cask beers, if the beer is matured for long enough, and by that I mean the yeast are still active, but it's 4 to 6 weeks old. Sort of mature beer, 4 to 6 weeks old in a bottle or in a cask, will have a good head on it. And I didn't need any oats or wheat in it. Also, some people can taste wheat and oats. As I was saying earlier, they can taste that above the barley and they don't like it. And some people are purists and they don't want anything like that in their beer as well. But I actually didn't find it did anything extra for me. You know, if you leave the beer long enough, it'll be fine. You'll get a good head on it.
Okay, so we've now got a question in from Nick Cooper, who says, what quantity brews did you start with, and when did you do it?
The quantity I started with was actually 5 litres. So it was a gallon brew, because I was doing it on a stove top, and it fitted on a stove top. I could manage to lift 5 litres. It wasn't too difficult, and it went fine. It worked well, but it was a hell of a lot of work for 8 pints at the end of it, and trying to keep your hands off of those 8 pints to leave it long enough to find out whether it matured really nicely was quite difficult. So I moved on to the 21 litres. And so on, and that sort of moved on to 80 litres, and now we're up to 180 litres, and we're getting some new equipment in shortly, which will bring us up to 300 litres. So things change, and brewing something with in a large quantity, the brew is different. The brew is different, and you've got to do things to maintain the quality. But 21 litres, I've mentioned, is what most of these kits do. So you can buy one kit, brew 21 litres, so you've got roughly, I don't know, 35, 40 pints, something like that, or 500ml bottles. And that's enough, really, if it's just for yourself and your friends. Or buy 2 of them and do 42 litres if you've got the right size pots.
Okay, well, if anybody else has got any final questions, then this is going to be about your last chance to ask them. There are, as I say, events going on all week. I've mentioned the ones that are going on over the next few days. All the rest of the events are on the website, so you can either click on the Cambridge Camera website or go to the Cambridge Beer Festival website to find out what's on for the rest of the week. The very final thing on the Saturday, of course, is Simon Gibson talking about Simon Cider, and that's sure to be one of the highlights of the week, I feel. So that is one to look forward to, but there's a lot of interesting stuff coming up, so do check the website and join in with the sessions that are coming on later in the week. Well, I don't seem to have any final questions, Cliff, so
okay,
just
Steve.
for me to say thank you very much for coming on tonight and giving us the benefit of your experience in brewing and explaining to people how they can get started home brewing. We have got a final thank you from Nick Cooper. So yeah,
Okay.
okay. Unless you've got any final things you want to say, Cliff.
Well, just thank you, Steve, for coordinating this for me. Thanks to Cambridge Camera, for asking me along. Thanks to all those who asked questions, and to Nick, I saw the thank you come up. The questions are great. I mean, that's the interaction is good. It's quite difficult using Zoom and all these things, but I think we're getting a bit more used to it with the strange times we find ourselves in. But thanks very much, everybody.
I think we'll be experts at it by the end of the week.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks a lot, Steve.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. And as I say, do come back and watch some more of the webinars during the course of the week. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks. Bye.